What does God have to say to a coronavirus world? My point here is not so much that God has something new to say to us, but that God has always been speaking to us. But actually, it's only in certain situations that we start to hear what he's been saying. Take the example of going to the dentist. My dentist regularly tells me I should be doing certain things, using this method, use this product. When do I actually do what he says? It tends to be when I get a bill for loads of dental work, or I get a huge filling or something. And it's then that I start to listen, really listen to what he's been saying to me all along. It's a little bit like that with God speaking to us. Now, I've got a Bible here, and as we ask that question, what is God saying? How do we go about hearing from God from the Bible? Do we just go to some of the obvious passages that speak about hand washing or cooking our food thoroughly, or even not eating bats? Yes, that is addressed in Leviticus 11. We want to use the Bible properly. So I want to take us to a very brief encounter that Jesus has with one very desperate man in the Gospels, because it's a great summary of what God has always been saying to us. And it's a summary that really describes the whole of the Bible's message. I'm turning to Mark chapter 1 and verse 40. You can follow that in any Bible. I'm using the ESV version, which we use here at Gunnersbury. And a leper came to him, that's to Jesus, imploring him, in other words, pleading with him, and kneeling said to him, "If you will, you can make me clean." Moved with pity, Jesus stretched out his hand and touched him and said to him, "I will, be clean." And immediately the leprosy left him and he was made clean. Okay, 3 verses, very brief description, but a dramatic encounter. The man starts a leper and ends up an ex-leper, for all you Monty Python fans. Now, leprosy is a pretty hideous disease. Wonderfully, it's largely eradicated today, but it is still a horrible thing. What is known as Hansen's disease is proper leprosy. That is very likely what this man has. It infects you from the inside. It damages nerve endings. Features, particularly the nose, tend to collapse inward. There is disfigurement. It's horrendous. It was considered highly contagious and totally incurable at the time that this gospel is written. And this man would have been utterly cut off from society, from his whole community. He would have lived outside of the city, outside of the town, perhaps in a valley or some caves or something they would tip bread in. Basically, they were saying, "But we can't help you. You're in God's hands now." So we have this leper who has an astonishing encounter with Jesus. Now let me ask you a question. These lepers, I've said they were cut off from society. They're basically considered like zombies. They were the living dead. And you know, we have this fascination, don't we, with zombie films nowadays. And you don't want to get near a zombie because you fear they will come and share their death with you and bring you into the world of the living dead. It's a little bit like that with this man. Let me ask you a question. What would it take for you to make physical contact with this leper? What would it take for you to touch him? We're going to come back to that question because we need to ask, why does Jesus actually touch him? Why would he resort to that? But just think about this scene for a moment, because it starts to help us answer the question, what is God saying to us? As we look at this scene with this leper and what Jesus does, we can start to hear what God is saying to us. and to our world. First of all, God is saying how close and certain death is. God is saying that to us at the moment, how close and how certain death is. And that's always been the case. We might think that this is the case for some people who've experienced death or have a particular illness. But actually the Bible has always said death is close and certain to every single one of us. So I'm reading from Psalm 90. It talks about our years are soon gone and we fly away. So teach us to number our days that we may gain a heart of wisdom. The Bible has always been saying, live in the light of your short end, your limited years. Don't live in denial of death. There was a book written a few years ago which describes our society's denial of death really well. Here's a summary by another writer. Ernest Becker's thesis was that the idea of death, the fear of it, haunts the human animal like nothing else. He said we arrange our lives around ignoring or avoiding or repressing the most irrefutable fact in the world, which is that we're going to die. The desire to deny death is the reason for our workaholism and approval addictions and obsession with security. It is what he calls the mainspring of human activity. Now, we deny death in our society. We push it to the margins, to our care homes, to our hospitals, our funeral directors, out of sight, out of mind. This leper is pushed to the margins of society, out of sight, hopefully out of mind as well. But God says to us, don't fear death and don't hide from it. You don't need to do that. Rather face it and hear what I have to say about it. Learn that actually you can enjoy life far more when you hear what I have to say about life and death. That enables us to be fully ready for death. So first big thing God is saying to our world is how close and certain death is. Get a glimpse of that in this passage. Second thing is God is saying to us how deadly and how universal the cause of death is. Leprosy, as we're seeing here, is a symbol of a deeper problem. And we've seen that he was banished from the margins of society. Now, in Jesus' time, think of Jerusalem, which had the temple right at the center of it. That was symbolic of God's presence. The further away you get from Jerusalem, the further away you were from God's presence. This leper is in a pretty bad way then with God. And the Bible tells us that our sin separates us from our God. Now, it is not saying, therefore, that this leper did something sinful or wrong, and that's why he has leprosy. Not at all. It's not linking those two together. But it does use leprosy as symbolic of our sin sickness. And the Bible says that that's relevant to all of us, not just people who do really bad things. For all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. That's Romans chapter 3:23. Now, I think this is probably something that's quite a hard pill for us to swallow. As we think about our own lives, we can get quite defensive about that. You're calling me a sinner? Is that what you're calling me? Well, the Bible, yes, says we're all sinners. And it invites us to think about what sin is. It's not something we can play with. It's not a little fun thing that we can just enjoy in life. That's kind of how we see sin today. Actually, it's a disease that separates us from God and leads to death. It's not something we can play with. God's always been warning us about this. And actually, if we look inside at our own hearts, then you find that you don't have to look elsewhere to see things that are pretty ugly. I can see things in my heart. I can see that the seed of every wrong and wicked thing, the seed of it, is there right in my heart. So God is saying how close and certain death is. God is also saying to us how deadly and how universal the cause of death is. It's not just a skin problem, it's a sin problem as well. Third thing that God is saying to us is how not in control we really are, how not in control we really are. You get a couple of groups, well, you could just divide the world into two groups. People who think they're in control and people who know they're not. What category is this leper in? Clearly, he knows he's not in control. He falls at Jesus' feet. He's pleading that he'd be taken out from this world of the living dead and that he would have life. He's desperate for life. He's not in control. And the Bible says that actually none of us are in control. We live in this delusion. I think normality feeds our delusion that we have some sort of control over life. Let me read to you something that comes later in the Bible, where the church leader James writes, and he says, you people making plans to go here and there and do this trade and make a load of money. James chapter 4, verse 14, yet you do not know what tomorrow will bring. You do not know what tomorrow will bring. Well, how true that has been of us this year in 2020. Let me challenge you to go back to your diary, see what you had planned, projects, holidays, exams. Any of that happening yet as you planned? The delusion of normality has been stripped away from us. And God is saying to us that we're not in control. I'm not in control, and I never have been. But as we look at this encounter, we see that Jesus is in control. And we're meant to understand that he always has been. Fourth thing that God is saying to us, fourth, last, wonderful thing. And I want to return to that question. What would cause us to touch this leper, to make physical contact with him? What would cause Jesus to do that? Why does Jesus do it? Because Jesus didn't need to. There's another miracle recorded elsewhere where Jesus just heals someone from a distance. He doesn't need to touch anybody. But he does. We're very specifically told that he reaches out and touches, and he wants us to see things about himself that are still true today. First of all, he wants us to see that he is willing. We're told something about his heart. He's moved with pity. He says, I am willing. And he shows that by touching this man in this shocking way that would have caused gasps of shock from onlookers. Let me read you a little story of a young boy and his sister. And it's a story about willingness to give oneself for someone else. It's about this boy and his sister needed a blood transfusion. The doctor explained that she had the same disease that the boy had recovered from 2 years earlier, and her only chance of recovery was a transfusion from someone else who had previously conquered the disease. The two children shared the same rare blood type, so the boy was the ideal donor. The doctor asked the boy, would you give your blood for Mary? Johnny hesitated. His lower lip trembled. Then he smiled and said, sure, for my sister. Soon the two children were wheeled into the hospital room, Mary pale and thin, Johnny robust and healthy. Neither spoke, but when their eyes met, Johnny grinned. As the nurse inserted the needle into his arm, Johnny's smile faded. He watched the blood flow through the tube. And with the ordeal almost over, his voice, slightly shaky, broke the silence. Doctor, when do I die? And only then did the doctor realize why Johnny had hesitated. Why his lip had trembled when he'd agreed to donate his blood. He thought that giving his blood to his sister meant giving up his life. In that brief moment, he'd made his big decision. Now, Johnny fortunately did not have to die to save his sister, but the Bible is saying that each one of us has a condition far more serious than Mary's, and it requires Jesus not just to give his blood, but to die in order to save us. He's willing, just as Johnny was willing, but Jesus is willing and he's able. So Jesus is willing, and he wants us to see that in this action here. Jesus also is close. In fact, in Jesus, God is close to us, and this is why Jesus reaches out and touches to show us this, to ram home that wonderful message. He didn't need to touch, but he did. Can you imagine someone embracing someone who's fully contaminating with coronavirus? Maybe they're crying and they're sweating, and an NHS worker just puts their arms around them and hugs them. That would be shocking, wouldn't it? We would not expect them to do that. But Jesus does this action because in Jesus, God has come close to us. That is the lesson to us. He's come close to an unclean world. Jesus is willing. Jesus is close. And Jesus touches this man because also we're to see that he is able. He is able. So we see the immediate result is that the leprosy left this man and he was made clean. It goes into reverse. His nerve endings are restored. His disfigurement, I take it, is completely gone. Everyone can see that he no longer has leprosy. He's cleansed from it. We're meant to see here that Jesus has power to cleanse our world with all of its sin and wickedness, power to cleanse your heart and mine. There's some other detail just after the healing that's really wonderful as well. There seems to describe a sort of role reversal between this leper and Jesus. We start off with Jesus being the one who's able to move around normally in society. And we see the leper who is not free to do so. But after the leper is healed, Jesus warns him, says, don't go and tell people, because Jesus knew that it would restrict his own ability to move and to operate. But the man disobeys him. And so Jesus finds that as this man went freely talking about Jesus, Jesus could no longer openly enter a town, but was out in desolate places, which is language that you would expect to be used for the leper. Whereas the leper has language that you'd expect to use for a free person. There's a role reversal going on that it hints towards what is coming, what Mark will describe later on in his gospel. As Jesus, as the perfect one, goes to the cross, and he will receive the judgment that sinners deserve. He will receive that on himself because he will take their sin on himself. And so this touch of Christ that the leper receives here is something that you and I, anyone, can receive when we come to Jesus unclean, and through the cross we receive his cleansing, and he takes our sin and deals with it on the cross. So in what circumstances would you touch this man, this leper? You wouldn't, would you? I wouldn't. But Jesus did. Because he alone can make the unclean clean. He can do so physically. More importantly for us, he can do so with our hearts and with our sin sickness of our hearts. So God has always been saying these things. He's always been saying, I've sent my son to cleanse you. Jesus touched this leper, and Jesus would do the same to us. He would touch each one of us and cleanse our hearts. That's what God has always been saying to us and to our world, coronavirus or not. Well, if you wanted to know more about this Jesus, there are a few things you could do. You could get into conversation with the person who sent you the link to this video. It's very likely that they're a Christian. They believe in this Jesus, and I'm sure they'd love to talk to you more about him. You could read on. You could do both. You could read on in Mark's Gospel. We've looked at some of the first chapter. Keep going. Keep seeing who this Jesus is, what he's come to do. Better still, you could talk to God. You can talk to God, and as you do so, if you're talking to God on the basis of who Jesus is, the fact that Jesus shows God to be willing and close and able, then that's how we receive the touch as we find forgiveness, by bringing our sins to him and asking for cleansing. I pray that this pandemic might be the best thing that has ever happened to you.